what it wants from us as readers. And then I'll wrap up with a little bit of discussion and a reading of the text that Professor El Fahli mentioned, Ask Me for the Moon, which I wrote in 2004. So what is literature? Huge question. But I think in relation to the topic today, we want to go way back and think about literature as a means of human expression, but one that has always been connected to technology of some kind. So what is technology? Technology, with some definitions, is doing things with something, getting something done with some kind of tool, engaging with the material world in order to accomplish our goals. What is literature made of? Literature is made of language. Language, I would argue, is one of the earliest human technologies. Just as we harnessed fire to cook and warm ourselves, as we use stones to make tools to get things done, we use sounds, the sounds our voices can make to communicate with each other. We figured out ways of putting them together to get things done as a collective, as a social unit. So literature, language, and technology have always been sort of intersecting with each other. But as we went on, we began to use things like stones for something other than getting things done in a very instrumental way. We started to carve them into shapes, into sculptures. We started being interested in uses of the material world for reasons other than just instrument and accomplishment and goal seeking. We did the same thing with language. We initially used it as a way of sending messages, organizing ourselves as a unit, but then we began to sing and we began to tell stories. And we began to use the technology of language to do something that was beyond the purely instrumental. It was aesthetic, it was moral, it was a way of firing our imaginations and thinking about who we were. So in the very early stages of this intersection between literature and technology, we saw that intersection. Our technologies developed. We developed writing. Some of us developed writing. Gradually, we developed print. And print was one of the major means for what we now call literature to be reproduced and to be disseminated. And at the same time, even as we were using technology to create literature, to distribute it, to read it, the technology was shaping the literature. If you think about the 19th century novel, Dickens, Balzac, those authors initially published their novels in serial form, in print journals, one section after another. And Dickens is famous for having used that technique for distributing his work as a way of shaping his story. He would end sections with some kind of suspense to make readers want to get the next installment, want to buy Household Words, which was his journal. So in thinking about literature and technology, if we think that literature is a non-instrumental use of language to do something other than simply convey information, if we think about literature as something that's been shaped, and we have terms in literary studies for talking about the shaping of language that happens in literature. We call them figures, we call them tropes. Trope, as I'm sure you know, comes from the Greek word for turning. So a trope, figuration, the rhetorical shaping of language, turns away from the purely instrumental use of language as a means of conveying information. I want to argue that when the technology of digitized text and the technology of the World Wide Web, algorithmic means of manipulating texts on a screen, when those technologies came into being, writers, artists, found ways to figure those technologies, to make them tropological, to turn them away from the simply instrumental uses of computation, to make them into aesthetic objects, to make them into experiences for readers that was something other than consuming information. So the trope is, for me, one of the central things to pay attention to when we're reading any kind of literature. How does it turn from the conventional use of language to have some kind of effect on us as readers? And whether we're talking about narrative fiction, where you have different kinds of relationships between speaking voices, dialogue, narration, free and direct discourse, all the ways in which we think about how a fictional text has been shaped. Same when we think about poetry, when we think about meter, assonance, alliteration, all those technical terms we use for understanding how a poet has shaped the language of a poem. I want to suggest, and I'm going to talk about this today, that when we read electronic literature, and not just to the language, the way in which the delivery system back of the text has also been made tropological, has been turned role as simply a means of. When I teach literature classes, I always turn to the Chakraborty Spivak, who through her career said this thing in various ways, but one of the earliest statements she makes is where she says, a book after nation. And one of the chief pleasures of reading is to discover what one to. So this idea of as an invitation to our imagination, for me, is really exciting. Students to approach whatever text. How is it? Now, electronic literature captures our attention in ways that are different than print literature. One of the key things we notice across many, many examples of electronic literature is that the text moves. It engages the programming capacity to make the text move around on the screen. So it involves kinesis, cinematic. It takes on some of the capacities of film. It also behaves along with movement. It will do things sometimes like stop for a period of time, or it will decide that you can do one thing but not another as you read it. So there's an aspect of performance, of drama in an electronic text. The other difference from print is that I think if people could mute themselves, it might be good. There's some background noise. I'm not sure if other people hear it too. Thank you. Another difference is that many works of electronic literature actively respond to what readers are doing. The easiest example is hypertext, where you have options for choosing, and then it responds. It sends you somewhere else. Or you move your cursor across the screen and something happens. So the text responds to you in a way that a print text doesn't. And I in no way want to suggest that electronic literature is better than print, although critics will make that argument. For me, one of the most important dimensions of this form of is that many offer us choices, and those choices are often consequential. It a story. It determines how we get to different places within a game. Many works have taken on the characteristics of games. But for me, the fact that electronic texts often invite us to choose for me is both an aesthetic dimension, but also a moral dimension of the text, that it makes is in relation to what the text is to tell us. So those are important differences between print literature and electronic literature, and I'll have some examples of this later. So given that it's different in this way from the texts that most of us are used to reading and thinking about as literature, what does e-literature want from us? What does it expect us to do as readers? The first thing I would say, and this is again what I tell my students, some of whom are not initially welcoming to electronic literature, is openness. We need to be open to what the text is as an object, as an aesthetic object. We need to understand it on its own terms. And if we come to a work of digital literature with the presuppositions we bring to a 19th century novel, or even a modernist novel, or a formal poem like a sonnet, we're going to be disappointed. We're going to be confused and not understand what's going on, and we might resist what the text is trying to do. We might refuse the invitation the text is issuing. So I want to pick up a term that I take from one of Professor El Fahli's articles, one on historical film from your region. Professor El Fahli notes that some historians are critical of historical films because they see history as down, conveying the facts as they come to us. And Professor El Fahli says that the problem with that approach to historical film is a kind of graphocentrism, that we place so much emphasis on the written word, the fixed written word, that we miss the dimensions of film that can convey history to us in ways that are maybe more emotionally resonant, maybe that are more capable of making us aware of some of the contradictions and discrepancies and exclusions that conventional history suffers from. And so I think for me, I read up on some of your professor's work before I started, and I was really taken by that, because I think that is one of the ways we need to approach electronic literature, not focusing exclusively on the text, on the written text, on the words, although the words are essential, and thinking about the intersection of the words and the various ways in which computation comes into play is essential to a responsible, engaging, interesting, critical approach, critical analysis of any work of electronic literature. So in addition to just basic openness, coming at it without a lot of preconceptions about what it's supposed to do, it demands our attention. All literary texts, if we're reading as critics, if we're reading as students, we need to pay attention to them. We need to look for those moments of figuration, of troping, ways in which the text is inviting us to think about language, to think about storytelling in ways that might be surprising to us. So attention to detail, attention to what's going on in the text, but attention also to all those features that come from the fact that the text was written for the computer screen or for the touch screen. And that's a kind of engagement. So as I was saying, texts invite us to interact with them, to make them behave in certain ways. They ask us to make choices. As we read, we have to make those choices. We have to play with the text. We have to do what the text is asking us to do, whether it's following a link or moving our cursor or looking for something on the screen, because all of those elements, if a text has been carefully written, has been carefully designed, all of those navigational elements are as essential to the meaning of the text as whatever similes or metaphors or metonymies or points of view the text might incorporate in its verbal dimension. The other thing I think e-literature wants is connection, contextualization. We need to think of it not only as this completely innovative, completely new, avant-garde thing. Most texts, and some more than others, are deeply connected with the history of literature. They are full of intertextuality. They make references to other texts. They know where they are in the trajectory of certain literary movements. And if we're reading critically and responsibly, we want to think about how those texts are making links down through history, to other texts, to other literary movements, to other historical events. So connection, looking for intertextuality, looking for the text in its relationship with the history of literature. And finally, something that I think is true for most texts, but is crucial to electronic literature, is care. And this goes to something I'll talk about later, which is the fact that unlike print, which is also vulnerable to fire and water and all kinds of problems, electronic literature is unusually vulnerable to obsolescence. And there's a very big movement now within the field to find ways of preserving early works of electronic literature, which are now unreadable on modern computing platforms. So I'm going to begin by going back in time, thinking historically, to a text that I think is a forerunner to electronic literature. And that's Bertolt Brecht's 1929 libretto for a cantata performance that's called the Lindbergh Flight. And this cantata, this performance, does two things. It engages with Charles Lindbergh's historic flight across the Atlantic in 1927. So it taps into the technology of air travel. But it also represents Brecht's criticism of the technology of radio at the time. Brecht was suspicious of radio, useful thing, but he felt that radio needed to be developed in such a way that not only could messages be sent out, broadcast to an audience, but the audience could also respond, talk back to the radio transmission. So at the Baden-Baden Chamber Music Festival in 1929, the Lindbergh Flight was staged for the first time. And as you can see in the photograph, it was set up in a way that incorporated both text and music and song. The orchestra was on one side of the stage, representing the radio. Charles Lindbergh, representing both the pilot of the plane and the listener to the radio, was separated on the other side of the stage and projected on the background and the wall. This is a projection onto the wall, was a text Brecht wrote that tried to get at the idea that we need to think about music, think about art, think about the radio, not simply as something we consume passively, but something we engage in actively. And one small detail about this text that I think is important is that when Charles Lindbergh was revealed to be a Nazi sympathizer, Brecht changed the title of this cantata to The Flight Over the Ocean and expunged Lindbergh's name from the text altogether. So an example of a work of art that combines text, music, performance, as well as a critical perspective on a current technology. I know that the students in the group have just recently read The Jew's Daughter by Judd Morrissey, and I'll come back to this text in a bit. Judd published The Jew's Daughter in 2000, but The text I want to talk about now in relation to the Brecht text is a work that he wrote along with Laurie Talley called My Name is Captain Captain. It was published on CD-ROM in 2002. It was composed in Flash, the programming platform that a lot of electronic literature of the time was using. And it, like Brecht, engages with Charles Lindbergh's, as well as Amelia Earhart's flight over the in 1937, in which she disappeared, was never found, and was declared dead. And in addition to that, it also engages with the killing of Charles Lindbergh boy in 1932, and the eventual execution of Bruno Richard Hauptmann for the crime later, after he was convicted. So a lot of historical material is built into this poem, but it's designed in a way that I think is a powerful example of how computation, digital text, animation, movement are incorporated into a poem about a set of historical events in ways that reinforce what those events might mean for us. So the text proceeds, it's the organizing shape for the entire text is these two overlapping circles, this kind of Venn diagram. And initially, it just looks like a simple design element. It looks like the MasterCard logo at one point, which I thought they found was kind of disturbing. But in the actual work, these three little holes in the Venn diagram are streaming through with Morse code. Morse code was how Amelia Earhart was trying to communicate with the ship Itasca during her flight in 37. She was unable to interpret the code, which was part of the reason we think she went off course and crashed. So that's basic design element. The poem itself, after you clicked it and started it, has text moving across the screen, broken up in various ways, and eventually it looks like this. You can read it as it's gathering together, but it's difficult to read. I think difficulty is something that we need to stay with and tolerate as we're reading works of electronic literature, because the difficulty isn't just perverse. It's not just the author trying to upset us. Something is going on with the density and complexity and disorienting nature of this text. Many of the lines refer in direct or indirect ways to Earhart, to Lindbergh, to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was the kidnapper. But they also refer to things like being lost, being unable to find your way. So that I sat a very good literary critic down in front of this work back in 2003, and he couldn't read it. So it was completely frustrated. That challenged me to write an interpretation of this poem. As you move through My Name is Captain Captain, you come to various landing points, and one of them has this very basic shape of a table. It starts out as a table, and if you can see my cursor, it has a little handle on it, and you have to figure out that you can use your cursor to open a drawer in that table, and out of the drawer, of letters that then organize themselves into a circle. So again, strange, text behave in this way. I want to suggest, as I did in my reading of the text that was published in a book called Comparative Textual Media in 2013, that Morrissey and Talley have designed this text not just to represent Lindbergh's flight, Earhart, Lindbergh's Baby, but also to put us in a situation in which we have to navigate. And we have to navigate in a way similar to the way Lindbergh and Earhart were navigating their planes. And in English, dead reckoning. You figure out where you are by calculating the movement of a point ahead of you. Tricky kind of navigation. I think in French it's called naviguer à l'estime. So the text is set up in a way to reproduce in us as readers, in our experience of the text, one of the basic themes of air travel at that time, having to find your way. The other justification, for the way the text makes us look for things, makes us hunt around, makes us interpret what we're seeing, is that it's also an investigation, the kind of investigation that took place after the kidnapping of Lindbergh's Baby. So we are investigators, we are pilots, we are navigators as we go through this poem. The poem also drops in things that are clues. When people went out looking for Amelia Earhart, they decided she had landed on this place called Howland Island in the Western Pacific. They found a shoe that they think was Earhart's shoe, and the word shoe crops up many times in My Name is Captain Captain. So my point in comparing these two texts, Brecht's The Flight of Lindbergh and My Name is Captain Captain by Morrissey and Talley, is to show how the same material, the same historical stuff, has been transmuted into works of art that engage with the particular technologies of their time, and to give us a reading experience that doesn't just represent, but actually engages us somatically, perceptually, phenomenologically, within the kinds of experiences the characters, the historical figures were experiencing. So as